So in this presentation, we'll talk about modifying existing objects in very simple terms. We'll take a look at some of the other kinds of objects that we can add to our scene to make it look more interesting, and then we'll start talking about basic rendering. So at this point, I have some just really basic geometry that I've been throwing inside the scene just to experiment. I have my cone, cube, and sphere. And if I'm thinking in this in terms of a toy or a piece that I'm a 3D print for a board game or something, I could think of this as, maybe this is the body of the meeple or the player, this is the head, and this is the hat. So what I could do is, rather than leaving these named with their default names, which is a poor naming convention, if I select the name of the object and then just double click on it, that will allow me to rename this object. And it's a really good habit to get into early, that as we create objects, we'll start to name them. So I have the head, I have the body. Next I'll move to the sphere and I'll call this head. And then I'll call my cone, I'll call this hat. Okay, and so in the object manager, we have the ability not only to manage and select and rename, but the hierarchy here is a little funny in that we have the hat and then the body and the head, but I'm looking at my hat, which is followed by my head and then the body, and so maybe I want that to reflect the order that these things show up in. And so what I can do is I can grab the head and just move it up, and you'll see that as I'm moving this around, this arrow is kind of pointing left and down. If it's pointing to the left, that means I'm basically just changing the order in the hierarchy. If I end up getting the arrow pointing down, that means that I'm going to parent one object to another. We'll talk about the parent-child relationship in future presentations, but just know that you can rename objects in the object manager, and you can select and drag these around inside this list to reorder things. It's really important that we name objects according to what we intend them to be. It'll be easier for us to make sense of our scenes as they get more complex. So I'm going to select the body. In this case, it's the cube. And there's a couple of different object properties that I can play with. Now, there's a size that's represented in centimeters, and these should all be set to 200. And you'll notice that unless you've changed it, if you have a cube, by default, it shows up as 200 centimeters. Now, if I find the X size, it's represented by the X axis here. I can change this value to something maybe that's smaller than 200. I'll change it to 150 and I'll hit return, and you can see that that object gets narrower according to its X axis. So I can key in values here. I also have these little arrows that I can use to click up and down, or I can highlight in this space and use my mouse wheel up and down, or I can click and drag up and down, or left and right, up and down on these arrows. So not only can I click on the arrows, but I can click and drag up and down to kind of get this to change sizes. And also, if I have the object selected, you'll see that there's these little control points that are showing up in orange. If I roll my mouse over the control point that's in line with the X axis, I can just kind of click and drag. And so I'm not so concerned with the numbers. Okay, but I'm just clicking and dragging to visually change the size of that. And once I determine what I want this size to be, I usually take a look at these values and round them to the nearest whole number, or something that's, kind of some comfortable math. So let's say 280 is 280 centimeters. I'll just type in 280 and hit return. Makes it a little bit smaller, but later if I need to do some math or keep track of this value, it'll be much easier. In addition to keying in whole numbers here, we can also do some basic math. So if I wanted this half of the width of 280, I could do 280 divided by, so I'll do a /2 and hit enter, and you can see that it calculates the math directly in this space. And so if I wanted it twice the size of 140 centimeters, I'll use the asterisk times 2 and hit return. So you can see that it's very handy to be able to do some basic math in here. Okay, we can modify different objects. So right now, I can adjust the X, Y, and Z of this cube, but if I select my hat or my cone, you'll see that I have different properties for the cone. Here I have top radius, bottom radius, and I have height, and then I have some stuff about segmentation. We'll talk about segmentation in the next presentation. But the top radius is represented by the top of the cone, and right now it's set to 0. But if I just increase the value, and I'll do this a little bit more dramatically, you can see that that cone becomes less cone-like and more cylinder-like. So a lot of these basic parametric primitive objects, so these basic pieces of geometry that we start with that are governed by these parameters, okay, these object properties, these mathematic parameters, we can modify and change the shape of this object quite a bit, okay? So I'll just zero out the top and hit tab, and the bottom radius, maybe I'll set this to 55. The height I could change, and again, so I can kind of play around with these values. And each one of these has a little corresponding little control point here that if we can find them, we can play with them. Okay, so we can just kind of move things around here. Try to bump that top radius up so you can see the other control point here. Again, I'll use this trick of tapping the S key to zoom, so I can, just kind of manually manipulate these different points. Now, in addition to selecting an object and hitting the S key, if I get disoriented or I want to go back to my default view, the view that I started in Cinema 4D, I can also go to this View pull-down menu and choose to Frame Default. Okay, and that'll take us back to the view that we started in. So I'll just zoom back out, and now I have a better sense of kind of what my scene looks like. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about in this video presentation is being able to rotate objects. So at this point, we've been moving objects according to their individual axes. I'll just Command Z to undo to get that to move back to 0. We can scale or we can add to the radius or the height according to the axis of the object, depending on how it's constructed. And in addition to that, we can rotate objects. Now, there's a couple of different ways to rotate objects. I'll just use the rotate tool first, and we'll focus on this cone or a cube, because rotating a sphere, it's kind of hard to visualize this. So I'm just going to pan a little bit and change my view and zoom in with the mouse wheel a little bit here. I'm going to roll my mouse up. We have the scale tool. We'll avoid that for now. By default, we should have the move tool selected. Okay, that's what we've been using at this point. And just 2 tools to the right is this rotate tool. Now, when I click on rotate, you can see that the heads-up display with this little widget changes. Now, what we're looking at here are these rotation bands that are revolving around the axis with which it's restrained. And so if we want to rotate this object, just like moving, we only want to rotate it according to one axis. Now, if I rotate it according to the z-axis, you can see that this object rotates around the z-axis, or the blue axis. So the blue rotation band corresponds with the blue axis, and that will allow us to rotate it around its z-space. Now, if this is kind of an abstract thing or a hard thing to wrap your brain around in terms of how this is rotating according to what axis band, let's demonstrate with a cube for a moment. I'm going to go back to the move tool, and I'm going to move this cube off to the side here so we can focus on this a little bit more clearly. If I'm sitting at a campfire, and this is my marshmallow that I want to roast, okay, and I'm going to drive a stick through it to rotate it over a fire, to roast it, I can think of the axis that I'm driving the stick through to be the axis that I'm rotating around. So if I take a stick, and I'm just gonna, you don't have to follow along with the cylinder demonstration here, but I'll just take a cylinder, and I'll just quickly rotate this, and I'll change its size really quickly, and then I'll change its position. And I'm just gonna kind of eyeball this. Okay, it's not going to be perfectly aligned inside the cube, but we'll share some techniques on how to do that later. So I have my stick here, and I'm driving it into my marshmallow. Okay, if I have my cube selected, the stick is running in line with the z-axis. So if I go to rotate, and I rotate around z, that's the axis that it's rotating. If I go back to the Move tool and I look at the X-axis, or the red axis, if I go to Rotate and I rotate around the red axis, it's rotating around the X-axis. And so that's the basic concept behind rotating. And once you rotate an object, you'll notice that as I rotate this, go back to the Move tool, you'll notice that its axes are pointing in different directions relative to the world space. So we have local space, where the object has a local axis that's relative to itself. And then we have the world axis, which we can make sense of down here with this little widget and with some other indicators inside the scene. So experiment with changing the size of objects, rotating objects. In the next presentation, we'll talk about adding some basic lights to our environment and talk about really basic rendering so that we can kind of see the results of our basic 3D models that we've generated. But we'll do that in the next presentation.